China remembers what the West prefers to forget, and that memory has become a source of power. You've heard the phrase that trust takes years to build and seconds to destroy. Now imagine that reality playing out on the scale of an entire nation. Imagine being humiliated, divided, drugged, and controlled for more than a century by foreign powers who claimed they were bringing progress and civilization. Then imagine finally becoming strong enough to ensure it never happens again. That is China's story. And that story explains why, when Western countries speak about a rules-based international order, China hears something entirely different. To understand this mindset, we have to go back to the early 1800s. At that time, China was one of the richest and most advanced civilizations on Earth. China produced porcelain, silk, and tea, goods Europe was desperate to obtain. But there was a problem for Britain. China didn't want British products. They were content trading in silver, and Britain's silver reserves were rapidly draining. So what did the British Empire do? They began smuggling opium into China. Not in small quantities, but on an industrial scale. This was mass drug trafficking organized and protected by the state. The Chinese government tried to stop it. They appointed an official named Lin Zexu, who confiscated and destroyed over 1,000 tons of opium. In response, in 1839, Britain declared war. Let that sink in. Britain went to war because China refused to allow drugs to be sold to its population. This conflict became known as the First Opium War, and China was decisively defeated. Once Britain demonstrated that China could be beaten and forced into submission, other Western powers rushed in. Between 1842 and the early 20th century, China was compelled to sign what historians call the unequal treaties. These were not fair agreements. They were imposed under military threat. Each one stripped away sovereignty, territory, and dignity. The Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860 was even more devastating. British and French forces marched into Beijing and looted, then burned, a vast imperial complex that had taken over 150 years to build and contained priceless cultural treasures. It served no military purpose. It was destroyed simply to demonstrate dominance. By the late 1800s, China had been carved into so-called spheres of influence. For centuries, China had seen itself as the center of civilization. Then, within a few decades, it was reduced to a playground for foreign empires. The government was too weak to defend the country. Resources were extracted. Chinese citizens were treated as second-class people in their own land. In 1900, this tension exploded into the Boxer Rebellion. Ordinary Chinese citizens finally said enough. They rose up against foreign domination. The response was brutal. 8 nations, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, formed an alliance specifically to crush the uprising. Afterwards, China was forced to pay 450 million taels of silver in reparations. That was an astronomical sum at the time, equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars then and billions today. China was punished financially for resisting exploitation. This entire period, from 1839 to 1949, is remembered in China as the Century of Humiliation. And this isn't distant history that people vaguely recall. It's taught in schools. It's portrayed in films and television. Museums dedicate permanent exhibitions to it. When Chinese leaders speak about national rejuvenation or the Chinese dream, they're not using abstract slogans. They're talking about ensuring China is never weak, never humiliated, and never dictated to by outsiders again. The legitimacy of the Communist Party is built on ending this humiliation. When Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square in 1949 and declared that the Chinese people had stood up, it wasn't symbolic language. It was a direct response to a century of enforced submission. After 1949, China finally removed foreign control and began rebuilding. But did the West welcome this new China? Not at all. During the Cold War, the United States and its allies moved to isolate and contain China. Trade embargoes were imposed. China was blocked from United Nations for over 2 decades, with Taiwan holding its seat. Military alliances formed along China's borders. The message was clear. China would not be accepted as an equal. The Korean War between 1950 and 1953 deepened this divide. Chinese and American forces fought directly, and more than 180,000 Chinese soldiers were killed. From China's perspective, U.S. troops were stationed right on its border. Later, the Vietnam War unfolded in China's immediate neighborhood, again aimed at limiting Chinese influence. Even when China opened its economy in the 1970s, the relationship remained cautious and transactional. Fast forward to the modern era. China joins the global system, enters the World Trade Organization in 2001, and believes it is finally playing by Western rules. But from China's viewpoint, those rules kept changing. Western companies eagerly outsourced manufacturing to China and enjoyed cheap labor and massive profits. But when China began developing its own technology companies, Huawei, ZTE, TikTok, suddenly national security concerns surfaced. Sanctions were imposed. Restrictions followed. The United States banned Huawei from 5G infrastructure and pressured allies to comply. Whether those concerns are justified or not, China's interpretation is simple. It was acceptable when China made low-cost goods, but threatening when China became competitive. The same logic applies to the South China Sea. China certainly has territorial disputes there. But from Beijing's perspective, the U.S. maintains military bases in Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Guam, while aircraft carriers operate just off China's coast. Imagine Chinese warships routinely patrolling the Gulf of Mexico. How would Washington respond? Every few years, a new narrative emerges. China is stealing jobs. China is stealing technology. China is abusing human rights. China is conducting debt trap diplomacy. Some accusations may have merit, but China sees a consistent pattern: containment, regardless of behavior. One event in particular remains deeply ingrained in Chinese memory. In 1999, during NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia, U.S. missiles struck the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. 3 Chinese journalists were killed and dozens injured. The United States claimed it was a mistake caused by outdated maps. But from China's perspective, NATO was bombing a sovereign country without UN approval, and somehow hid an embassy that international law explicitly protects. Whether accidental or not, the lesson China drew was clear. International law applies selectively. Sovereignty is respected only when convenient. And Chinese lives are dismissed as collateral damage. Massive protests erupted across China. The anger wasn't temporary, it reinforced deep suspicions. Today, China is no longer weak. It is the world's second-largest economy, with ambitions to rival the largest. It has advanced industries, a modern military, and global influence. And it remembers everything. When Western leaders talk about a rules-based order, China hears an order created when it was powerless. When they speak of free trade, China hears rules that shift when competition becomes uncomfortable. When they lecture about human rights, China hears a tool applied selectively. Is this perception entirely fair? That's not the central question. What matters is that this is how China understands a world. And that understanding has been shaped by 180 years of experience. China's foreign policy only makes sense through this historical lens. China isn't collapsing. It isn't becoming a Western-style democracy. And it isn't forgetting. The competition between China and the West is rooted in historical mistrust, not misunderstanding. Can trust be rebuilt? That's difficult. Trust requires vulnerability. And China's history taught it that vulnerability invites exploitation. Trust also requires forgetting, while China has made memory a core element of its national identity. This doesn't mean conflict is inevitable. Nations that distrust each other can still trade, negotiate, and cooperate. But it does mean we are entering an era where the global system will be contested, where parallel institutions will emerge, and where every interaction is filtered through history. The Century of Humiliation may have ended in 1949, but its shadow stretches far into the 21st century. China remembers, and that memory has become policy. Thanks for watching.